Live from Arlington, Virginia, this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter. Sponsored by Spirion. Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Hello and welcome everyone to the latest edition of Newsmakers from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. I'm pleased to host this conversation with leading figures in the trucking, freight, logistics, and today, port industries. We have a great guest today, and we'll be talking about a very important topic concerning the operation of the nation's ports and the challenges that the thousands of men and women who are working there are facing, as we're making some progress on the supply chain, but they remain very backed up. Our guest is the Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach, Mario Cordero, who joins us from his office. Before we begin our conversation with Mario, I want to tell you that Spirion is the sponsor for this edition of Newsmakers. Their leadership has a short message they'd like to convey, so let's watch the message, and we'll be back with Mario Cordero on the other side.
With supply chain challenges mounting and trailers increasingly scarce, making the most of the trailers you have matters more than ever. Optimize your fleet with the right GPS solution and get the data and insight to maximize loads and turn trailers faster. Spirion's Fleet Locate Trailer Management Solution has the customizable trackers and sensors to do just that. Even with demand growing alongside labor shortages, you can still unleash your fleet's full potential with dedicated Spirion analysts that can manage your entire trailer fleet. Get all the data you need without burdening your own staff. Don't be held back. Increase your capacity and trailer turns, and optimize your fleet with managed services, all backed by award-winning customer support. Unleash your full potential. Visit Spirion.com/unleash.
Now a little bit about our guest, Mario Cordero, and his career. He's been the Executive Director at Long Beach now for going on 5 years, and he's been involved in the legal and shipping industry for more than 40 years, and is an attorney and a leading figure in the industry. Prior to moving back to Southern California, Mr. Cordero was a board member and later, for 4 years, the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission in Washington, D.C. In his position at Long Beach, he leads a staff of more than 500 employees and a budget of more than $622 million. Mario, it's good to have you, and welcome to TT's Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for this invitation. Looking forward to the conversation here.
Let's get a little assessment, if you will, or outlook about how things are doing at the Port of Long Beach. We are at the 2-year mark on the COVID-19 pandemic. Thankfully, it is starting to recede, and things are moving in the right direction. But you and others in the shipping industry have stressed that we need to be patient regarding the changes, the long-term changes that are taking place in the supply chain. Talk about that, please.
Well, number one, as you've indicated, things are a little bit better. Absolutely. And we're talking about the supply chain and disruption of the supply chain, which is a global issue with regard to the supply chain, and obviously COVID-19 based, when these issues commenced back in the spring of 2020. So where we're at now, obviously this is the nation's largest port complex here, the Port of Long Beach, along with the Port of Los Angeles. And together we moved 20 million TEU containers in year 2021. So obviously a significant amount of commerce, containerized commerce, that came through this port complex. So on that metric, we're doing very well in terms of moving the nation's cargo. And again, thanks to the men and women who work on the docks. There's never been the day that this port complex has closed down. And this has been basically an essential workforce, beginning when the crisis started back in the spring of 2020.
How is the move going to the 24/7 operation? That was something that was discussed last fall. White House officials, John Pocari, the port envoy who was in that position, was out there. Secretary Buttigieg has been out there. How's that move to 24/7 going?
Well, it's a work in progress, but the good news that we do have pilot projects now announcing to the industry that this is the direction that we're moving. So for example, in September of last year, the Port of Long Beach was able to partner with one of our terminals at TTI to have a 24/7 pilot project. And then in January of this year, on the Los Angeles side, the Phoenix Marine Terminal announced a 24/7 pilot project. And just recently, another terminal and the complex announced that they were going to move forward to open some gates during the hoot shift, which would be from 3 to 7 in the morning. So needless to say, it's not just a vision, as I expressed back in January 2018. I'm sorry, it's not just a vision anymore. It's now a work in progress. There's robust conversation with regard to the need for 24/7. And when I say, Dan, I'm talking about a 24/7 framework. Needless to say that short term, we're not talking about 7 days a week, 24 hours around the clock on each day. But the progress that has to be made here in the nation's largest containerized port complex is to expand the hours of operation. When you move 20 million containers here, needless to say, you cannot accept the status quo in terms of what that operation looked like previously. So it's a work in progress. So I'm very satisfied that there will be continued robust discussion about that framework, given that in my conversation with the stakeholders, the BCOs, the terminal operators, the carriers, and even the truckers, we all agree there's a need for that. It's just a matter of how we move forward to make that transformation.
How much additional capacity do you believe would be available if the port was optimized fully at 24/7? That's not going to happen, of course, but how much additional capacity could you see being moved into the port itself?
Well, it certainly would address the capacity constraints that we've experienced in the past year. More importantly, the distribution of how we move that cargo. So, for example, the trucking industry is fully aware that one of the issues that we have at Port Containerized Complex, and specifically here in the St. Peter Bay Complex, the truck turn time issue, the queue time issue. So query whether or not, if I'm a trucker, why am I going to wait 2 hours to get into the gate? If we distribute that volume, then perhaps we could get to a more efficient time in terms of how that movement is made. And let me give you one last example. In the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, if you're a trucker and you're going to take a container to the Inland Empire or further out, would you rather pick up that container at 5 in the morning or the status quo of coming here at 8 or 9 in the morning? I think the answer is pretty clear. You'd rather pick that container up at 5 in the morning and get out of at least the inner metropolitan area early before the commuting hours start. So would be a great measure in terms of efficiency. And of course, on that aspect, the hope is it increases velocity in terms of the movement of containerized cargo here.
Your facility and the adjacent Port of Los Angeles have had, as you pointed out, record container volumes, 20 million containers last year alone. Where do you see growth going on this? Do you see it 22 million containers this year between LA and Long Beach, 23 the following year? Where's it going to be?
Well, certainly the forecast is that number is going to increase. And by the way, the forecast, if you go back on what it was back in 2010 or even in 2016, it was at 20 million. So there's no surprise to anybody in terms of that cargo volume. So going forward, I will say that we're not going to have any less than that. The forecast right now in terms of the latest estimation that's been made is by 2030, we will have close to 28 million. And by 2040, hit a peak of 40 million. So whether we obtain those numbers or not, the fact of the matter is this year or calendar year 2021 and moving 20 million, we certainly need to make improvements in terms of how we move that cargo. Again, cargo velocity instead of talking about cargo volatility. So I'm pretty optimistic that those numbers are going to go up. But in that regard, to be competitive, I think that the plan of action that we have now will perhaps solidify that forecast that we hear today.
Just doing the math in my head as you were talking to me, that's probably an increase of 50,000 containers per month to get to that level. That's a pretty healthy growth rate, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it is. But on the other hand, I think if you Dan ask if you ask the question to any carrier executive, the CEOs of the major international carriers, ask them the question, where is the global market? I think every one of them is going to answer the question. The global market is going to be in the USA. And we're already seeing that we've had a tremendous recovery on the economy as compared to what it was back in the spring of 2020. And it's a remarkable fast growth that we had. So going forward, clearly you've seen the consumer demand here at a very high level. So I think that demand, whether it fluctuates, will continue to be a market that's going to be a global attraction here.
So much of what is taking place at your port and also as others as well is concerning imports. Are you concerned, though, that imports continue to significantly outperform the exports? And we make some good products here in the United States, excellent products, as a matter of fact. Are you concerned that number continues to be way out of balance?
Well, that imbalance with regard to the dynamic of trade, has existed and will continue to exist in some form. Obviously, you've seen that from the political arena. In the last administration, in those geopolitical discussions that impacted international trade, that was one of the hopes, to address the imbalance. Obviously, a tariff on products wasn't the answer, or tariff on commodities. So, but that imbalance will continue. I think the important point is, what do we do to accelerate the role of American exports? And that's a very key question. It's very important to a lot of us. So one of the reasons that you're seeing that at the congressional level, at a very high level, is the movement of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. In part, and I say in part, that's a reaction towards the fact that the American exporter needs, again, to be highlighted here in terms of making sure that that product that goes back to Asia or anywhere else in the world is a prioritized product. So certainly, whether you go back to the Obama administration, that is the National Export Initiative, to current day, that continues to be a full court press priority to make sure that we amplify not only the ability of the American exporter to move these goods in a timely fashion, but also keep emphasizing how important the American export is, and of course the jobs that it produces in this country.
We're in a situation now in this country, because of what's taking place in Ukraine and Russia, that gasoline and diesel prices, and I don't need to tell you, being in Southern California, that you're probably paying $7 for gasoline out there in Southern California. But there are concerns about diesel prices. And one of the things I want to get your take on, and this may be a little bit out of your purview, but I want to ask you anyway. Do you believe that we will see higher shipping costs as a result of the fact that the ocean carriers are now using ships that can no longer burn bunker fuel? They have to run a cleaner fuel that's mixed with diesel in order to be on the high seas, and then, of course, be close to the ocean, be close to the shorelines. Are we looking at higher shipping costs, do you think, down the road?
I think this conflict persists in a way that will have that impact. That is a potential. I mean, presently, the good news is that the shipping costs, the transportation shipping costs, has gone down from what it was a year ago. So we're in a good position. But of course, the nature of these, the nature of these things is these unforeseen events. And right now we are struggling with that could be. So that is a concern. But again, hopefully those matters will moderate. I'm trying to be an optimist here. But absolutely, anytime you have world conflicts, you've already seen the impact of what it is to the oil and gas industry. Right now, we're at, what, 135 a barrel? That's a significant increase from where we were 2 years ago in terms of the price of oil. So our hope is that we continue to make progress with regard to the mitigation of the transportation costs as it related to the COVID-19 factor that we experienced here in the last couple of years.
But as someone who runs a gigantic port, and someone, when you and I have talked at events and on the telephone, you're very concerned about the environment and about the overall how you operate your port. Clearly, you're one that believes that the decision to get rid of bunker fuel, that tar-like substance, and clean up the shipping industry was a good thing in retrospect.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because again, clearly, as we move away from that dependency, there's a lot of good progress that's being made at all levels, in particular with regard to international vessels, whether it's Maersk, whether it's MOL out of Japan. These carriers have some pretty decarbonized high-level goals here. Now, it's not going to be anytime soon, but obviously, the more we get to some net zero emission and better use of alternative fuels, and some of what technology is being discussed the better we're going to be in the future in terms of the dependency on this whole question about bunker fuel and the costs that correspond to that.
At one time, Mario, you had as many as 60, 70 ships waiting in San Pedro Bay to get into Los Angeles and Long Beach. How's the improvement been? Where are you at now?
We're very good improvement, Dan. And let me just use the metric as to why I'm optimistic in representing that there's been a vast improvement. Back in January of this year, that number was at 109.
Wow.
So as of yesterday, that's gone down to 50. Now, so again, we're not out of this crisis, but certainly if you go back just a few months ago, we're doing a lot better on this. And I want to give a lot of credit to the White House envoy, John Picardi, who led these discussions with all the stakeholders to make sure that we do what we could or what we can do that was in our control to address this congestion bottleneck issues. So it's still a work in progress. I don't want to say mission accomplished, but nevertheless, to your question, we're doing better today than we were just 2 months ago.
Speaking of work in progress, let's bring up the issue of the number of containers that were sitting empty at your facility and also at the other facility over in Los Angeles. There was a dwell fee that was proposed almost 5 months ago, and it seems as though when I go on your website every couple of days, I see a notice saying that the dwell fee has been suspended for another week because progress is being made to get the empty containers off the property. How's that going?
It's going well. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we haven't moved to implement the fee is because of the progress that's being made. So, for example, the fee that we were talking about, that the tariff that was passed on by way of the tariff back in October, was addressed the latent imports. That is, loaded containers that had been at the complex for 9 days plus. If you use that metric in terms of what it was back on November 1st to what it is now, we're around a 54 to 60% reduction. So it's significant progress on that. Now, the other question is the number of empties. So, we've had a conversation in terms of our approach to that issue, but at this point, there's been progress in that arena. I could represent to you that, again, in terms of the capacity constraints that we were dealing with last fall at our terminals, the empty dynamic has gotten better. Like, for example, Long Beach, we're down to a 35 percentile of what that was maybe 4 months ago, that we were towing 45 to 49%. So that continues a very good work in progress, but good progress that we're making. And going forward, again, I think the stakeholders really have a real spirit of collaboration to continue to address these questions.
We're 2 years plus now into this awful pandemic, and thankfully it's starting to recede, and it looks as though we're putting COVID in the rearview mirror, thankfully. Talk about some of the work that's been done for the last 24, 28 months by the ILWU and others to keep your facility, to keep Los Angeles, to keep these ports open during these very difficult times.
Well, I think in particular, in specific to the ILWU, again, I think they've done a tremendous job in moving this cargo. As I said, they're an essential workforce, and no terminal has ever closed down here at the complex, and the men and women have worked day in, day out since the pandemic. Some of the work that we have done specifically to make sure that we mitigate the most negative impacts that this virus has on the workforce is we move forward for testing sites here early on. And at this point last year, we had a full court press on vaccinating the workforce on the docks. I think that those kind of policies that were led by our mayor here, Robert Garcia, and our governor, Governor Newsom, now you can see the results of that. Again, mission's not accomplished with regard to the virus at this point, but certainly we could say that it certainly mitigated the absenteeism that it would have caused on this workforce, but for that vaccination proaction that we did have.
I would imagine you also have high words and a lot of gratitude for the truck drivers and the warehouse operators who are in and out of your facility all the time, that they deserve more than a tip of the cap for the work that they've been doing.
Oh, no question, Dan. As you know, I've been very much a proponent of the truckers here in terms of how important that component is to the supply chain. And I think you're finding that though at this complex, we don't have too much of a shortage of trucking, so to speak. They're very busy. They're moving that cargo, again, day in, day out. And part of, in fact, like as we said at the beginning of this conversation, my view of the 24/7 vision really is addressed to making it easier for the truckers to, again, increase their earnings, so to speak, or what they make in terms of this transaction, because a lot of them is based on turn time. So the more that we could distribute that time so they can make 3-4 turns a day, the more they could profit from this operation. So the trucking component is very important to this complex. And I think a lot of the questions that we are dealing with the operational issues, the gate issues over the last couple of years, has definitely been because of the fact of that negative impact it has on the trucking industry.
The ILWU has a contract that expires the end of June, and I know this isn't under your jurisdiction in terms of the executive director of the Port of Long Beach, but any concerns or thoughts on the process itself? I would imagine you are one that hopes that the two sides are able to reach an agreement and that there's no difficulties, and collective bargaining is always a challenge, but I imagine you're watching this pretty closely.
Yes, we are. And again, I'm optimistic that the concern that it's going to be a prolonged negotiation that will be a repeat of what happened in 2014, I don't believe that's going to be the case. And the reason is because, as I've referenced, in the last several months, if you go back to September, these White House envoy-led stakeholder meetings has included the ILWU, has included the marine terminal operators and the carriers. And I think I've noticed, I could say that I can represent to you, we had a very good collaborative spirit in addressing all the issues that we needed to address in this port complex. So I'm hopeful that collaborative spirit vicariously moves over to this negotiation tables between the PMA and ILWU, because I think they both know how important this is to make sure that they come to a meeting of the minds at some point, because again, this is the nation's largest port complex, and needless to say, the fact of the matter that the White House appointed an envoy to come to Southern California and address these issues kind of is indicative of how important this gateway is to the nation.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to hit on two topics that I know are very important to you and get your thoughts on that. So that's really what I want to focus on here for the next couple of minutes. The Biden infrastructure law contains $17.2 billion in dedicated money for ports. Have you and your team looked at your needs and assessed how some of that money could be coming your way? And also, your governor, Gavin Newsom, wants to use a significant amount of state money. The state's running a pretty significant surplus to try and help with infrastructure. How do you see this money being brought into your facility? And also, I know you can't speak for Gene Soroka, but since you guys work in concert, how do you see it being divvied up?
Well, first of all, it's a great step in the right direction that both the state of California and Washington, D.C. is investing in the port. So that's the great news. As Secretary Buttigieg said when he visited the port complex here back in January, it's time for investment as opposed to the historically disinvestment. So it's great news in terms of the monies that we hope to receive. Now, already for the Port of Long Beach, as you may well know, through the PDIP grant process by way of the TOT, we received $53 million towards our Pier B rail enhancement facility. That's great news. It was the most significant funding to any port authority in the United States. So going forward, I'm sure that the nation's ports are prepared now to making sure that they receive the type of funding that, again, over the years they have not received. But more specifically for the West Coast ports, that has been a serious dismissal here over the many years in terms of the investment that's been made in the West Coast ports as opposed to the East Coast ports. So I think it's fair to represent that each port here, at least in the state of California, we're putting our proposals together in terms of the monies that we require to make sure that we continue to be competitive, but continue to have a port complex that rises to the occasion about what we need to do to further velocity and reliability in the movement of cargo.
You and being in Southern California, you have a port, you in Los Angeles, that face some pretty significant environmental challenges, especially when it comes to air quality. I know that from our discussions, you're a big proponent of electrification. Is electrification and the use of alternative fuels taking place fast enough, in your opinion, at port complexes?
Well, it's not taking place fast enough, but I have to say that the reason for it is because of the technology as to whether or not that's commercially available. So in fairness, we all knew that we put together the plan. When I say we, in partnership with the Port of Los Angeles, and we put forward the Cleaner Action Plan in 2017, which stated our goals of zero emission cargo handling equipment by 2030, and trucks by 2035. We knew that was going to be a work in progress over many, many years. For example, to transform the trucking drayage to zero emission by the electric truck technology, it's still challenging. I mean, overall, we estimated 12 to 14 billion dollars to address this issue. But obviously, we all know that electric trucks just aren't there in the numbers that we should have. But we knew that when we put forward the plan in 2017. So the good news is that it is accelerating. I think we're going to have zero emission trucks way before 2035. So there's a good news in terms of what that is in the coming years. So it's not as fast as we would like it, but there's a good reason for that because, again, all this is assumed that we would have the technology that's commercially available in terms of whether it's cargo handling equipment or trucks. And the other thing that we are doing in both ports is having demonstration projects with regard to this zero emission technology. So whether it's electric battery or whether it's hydrogen fuel, I think it's fair to say that we have a number of demonstration projects at this port complex, which brings a lot of promise in terms of the coming years.
A couple of other questions I want to ask you. Real estate is so valuable in Southern California, even further to the east when you get out east of Los Angeles, a little bit, maybe 40, 50 miles out there. There's virtually no warehouse space available. And I know that your port and Los Angeles, Oakland, and up in Seattle, Tacoma, have been working with the folks in Salt Lake City to try and move some of that cargo further inland, 800 miles off of your property through rail. Can you speak to that for a couple of minutes and tell us what exactly is all of that, how that's working out?
Well, this is the plan of action as it relates to accelerating rail movement. I mean, one of the questions in terms of what our needs are for investment in this port complex, specifically for the Port of Long Beach, is investment in rail. I mentioned our next grand endeavor here, the Pier B Rail Enhancement Facility at the tune of $1.2 billion costs. So obviously that plan of action, which in my mind will be the state-of-the-art rail facility at a port complex, also is indicative of what we need to do on rail. So to your question, the connectivity that we need to have with the inland, whether it's the Utah Inland Port Authority or as we go west to other states like Arizona and Nevada, I think it's crucial, key to move this containerized cargo to an inland port concept. This is something, Dan, as you know, we've been talking about for many, many years. But the good news is there's now more than conversation having. There's now a lot of action being taken in terms of the moving forward the whole question of the inland port. Nothing new to this industry. Many ports in Europe have a very well integrated inland port structure. So it's something that, again, is going to be a necessity here for the nation's largest port complex.
Finally, in the short and the long term, are you optimistic that with some hard work and creativity, the problems in the supply chain, which from a reporter standpoint, I mean, they're fun to write about. They're interesting, they're challenging, and I get to talk to smart people like yourself about these. Are you optimistic, though, that in due course, these problems will work themselves out?
Yes. Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think, again, there's a lot of exciting things. And we've gone through a very tragic 2 years with this global health pandemic. But again, if you use the old cliche of crisis brings opportunities, the opportunities that it has brought forth to this industry is for people to realize that the supply chain prior to COVID was a fragile supply chain, not too much resilience. But the good news is, like I said before in this question, previous question that you asked, we're getting investment from DC, we're getting investment from Sacramento, we're getting attention, and I think the nations realize how important goods movement is to this country, and particularly the role that port authorities play.
And we need more people in the logistics and the freight industry to consider this as a career, don't we?
Absolutely, and I think the jobs of the future are going to be very, very, very critical. And we know that one of the things that also is in the discussion is data sharing, digital transformation. For Long Beach, we announced here recently our information highway, our supply chain information highway, which is going to be an integrated system, what we call system to system, coast to coast, so that we can integrate data that's very crucial for this industry to share. And so that's another way of amplifying in terms of what we need to do in terms of transparency and interconnectivity in terms of that data sharing. So, and visibility. I mean, the bottom line is whether you're a shipper, trucker, carrier, I think that's utmost important right now. And of course, that's the next target for the White House in terms of how do we do that in a way that we have a standardized data system, a standardized data system. And that, in fact, I'm having a meeting, or some of us are having a meeting at the White House next week on that very issue.
Well, when you're in Washington, D.C., come by and find us, and let's sit down and talk some more and continue the conversation as well. Where can we find out more about the Port of Long Beach online, Mario?
Well, certainly you can go up on our website, pob.com, but more specifically, pob.com/COVID-19. That gives you some information in terms of what we've been doing as a result of the COVID-19 issue, and also pob.com/operations. That gives you more visibility in terms of the vessel movement that we've had here and the scheduling of vessels. So it's a great website to look at in terms of getting some data in terms of what's happening here in the complex.
Indeed it is. In closing, we want to thank the Port of Long Beach and its Executive Director, Mario Cordero, for joining us here on this latest edition of Newsmakers and being generous to take some time and talk with us. We also want to thank our sponsor, Spirion, for making this Transport Topics Newsmakers available. We always appreciate their fine support. Going forward, we're planning more of these Newsmakers in the near future, and we will have an announcement very soon about when the next webcast will take place and who the guest will be. I'm sure you'll be interested to find that out. This webcast available for on-demand viewing. Go to ttnews.com for more information and how you can watch our interview with Mario Cordero, Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. I'm Dan Ronan with Transport Topics, ttnews.com. We always thank you for watching.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.